Hey everybody, got a kind of a short video for you today. I know you were just working hard on those projects, so I thought we would just look at one battle and one of the reasons why the Civil War is so deadly. So we looked at the new kinds of weapons that are coming out, or we talked about it just a little bit. We'll talk about it more today. One of the reasons why the Civil War is so deadly is simply because it is a post-industrial war, meaning people are not just fighting this war with rifles that they brought from home, they are being mass produced. You see the first idea behind a machine gun in the Civil War, ironclad ships, and we'll look more at this later. But the first major battle of the war is actually called the Battle of First Manassas. That's what it's called by the South, and the North will call it the First Battle of Bull Run. Kind of an interesting thing. Northerners were more likely to live in cities, so they were going to be more likely to be taken or interested in the natural features of a battlefield, a river, a mountain. So they typically name things after some physical feature. So the North Bull Run was a river, really a creek that runs right through the battlefield. So they called it the First Battle of Bull Run. Southerners, much more likely to live on farms, much more likely to never have been to a big city. They're much more interested in train stations and towns and cities. So Manassas was the closest train station, so they will call it the Battle of First Manassas. Everyone thought this war was going to be one and done. One battle, the Union would crush the Confederates and it would be over. That changes very quickly. So the first battle of Manassas is the first battle of the war. It's actually pretty interesting. Many people thought it was going to be something to see. So they brought picnic baskets out. There were literally people going like they were going to go see a baseball game, going to see a battle. And there were so many people actually that it became a problem after the battle, and I'll talk about that in a second. It looked like the Union early in the day was going to win. There was a problem though. This guy, Thomas Jonathan Jackson. Thomas Jonathan Jackson was a he was a professor at the Virginia Military Institute. Kind of a strange guy, had all kinds of weird quirks. He thought his left arm had more blood than his right arm, so he would hold his left arm up in the air, try to let the blood drain. He thought pepper made his left leg weak, so he wouldn't eat pepper. It doesn't make any sense. He thought that if he ate foods that he really liked, he would gain weight. So he loved fresh baked bread, so he would only eat slightly stale bread, so he would only eat enough to stop being hungry. Kind of a strange guy. During the middle of the battle, though, it looks like the Union's about to win, but Stonewall Jackson led his men right up to the front of the battle and was standing firm, like he wasn't moving. He was not retreating like the rest of them. And a North Carolinian looks and sees Jackson standing there and he yells, "Look, boys, there stands Jackson like a stone wall. Rally behind the Virginians, boys, rally behind the Virginians." Thus, Thomas Jonathan Jackson became Stonewall Jackson for the rest of his life. The men called him Stonewall. He went by Stonewall to some people during the war. He is one of the top two commanders of the entire war, probably. He turns the tide so quickly, actually, the North starts to retreat. And they start to retreat rapidly, really rapidly. They run away. So bad that it becomes known as the Great Skedaddle. The Great Skedaddle. To skedaddle is to run away as quickly as you can. It's a great name. And it's so bad, in fact, all those people who came out to watch this battle are in the way. And a bunch of them get captured. A congressman got captured by the Confederates because he was out watching this like it was a picnic. Kind of crazy. The Confederates, though, Thomas Jackson, Stonewall Jackson, wants them to chase the Union all the way back to Washington and just take the city of Washington. Had they done that, the war would have been over. The Confederates would have won. But they don't. They don't. They don't listen to him. This is really could have ended the war before it really even began. The Confederates, some historians will say, they were as unorganized in defeat as the Federal troops were in defeat. I might have said that backwards. They were as unorganized in victory, as the Union was in defeat. This would not be a short war. And it shows that the Confederacy is going to be really, really good on the battlefield. What they may lack in resources and people, they are going to more than make up for in the ability to command troops. Now, there's something really interesting here. This is the image, the statue that stands on these grounds today of Stonewall Jackson and his horse, Old Sorrel. Sorrel is just a color of a horse. Here's the interesting thing. His horse was it was his wife's horse. It was kind of a scraggly old horse. Look at it in this picture. It's muscular and ripped. Look at Stonewall Jackson's arms. He's really buff in this thing. Look at him here. He was kind of a skinny guy, kind of not physically imposing at all, but it's one of the things historians find interesting, right? We look at this and we say, why is Stonewall Jackson pictured as this huge, hulking, almost superhuman figure? Like, look at the muscles in his legs and his arms and his chest. It's because of the image that he portrayed. He was so devastating on the battlefield that he gets this reputation for being almost superhuman. And part of it's that he's killed during the war. And we'll look at that later as well, right? Stonewall Jackson never becomes an old man in the eyes of many people. Kind of like Kobe Bryant to you guys, will never be an old man. You know, I grew up watching Kobe Bryant. I remember when he was I was 10 years old watching him play for the Lakers. In my mind, because he died young, I'll always think of Kobe Bryant as a young man, a young basketball player. I will never think of him as the way I might look at like a Magic Johnson getting older, right? You'll never know the old version of him. It's the same thing here. All right. In the West, though, we're going to see that in the East, near Virginia, eastern part of Virginia, lower Pennsylvania, the Confederacy is going to dominate. They're really going to dominate. In the West, however, which is kind of getting ignored because there are no newspapers out there sending reports all the time, the Union dominates. And, you know, if we look back to that Anaconda plan where they're going to choke the Confederacy, they need to take the West. This guy, Ulysses S. Grant, he graduates from West Point, which is the military academy, with Robert E. Lee. Robert E. Lee is at the very top of his class. He is the ideal student. He's the perfect student. Grant is not. Grant is at the very bottom of his class. He's always getting in trouble for not wearing his uniform correctly or making his bed, but he is really good on the battlefield as well. He takes two small forts, Fort Henry and Fort Donelson. We were driving through Tennessee with my wife's family, and I saw the sign for Fort Donelson, and of course I made them stop, and I really delayed their trip, but it was totally worth them all getting upset with me. Grant also wins a huge battle at the Battle of Shiloh. That's what the North will call it. The South will call it the Battle of Pittsburgh Landing. These are kind of getting ignored, these battles, while Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson are dominating in the East. But the Union has to take the Mississippi River, and this guy is getting it done. All right, so let's quickly look at why this is a revolution in warfare. Revolution warfare. This new bullet is called the Minié ball. Really should have been called as the Minié ball, named after a Dr. Minié in France who invented it. If you look, it's got a hollow bottom right here, which means it actually is going to go faster, and it's shaped like a football. The inside of the barrel actually has rifling now, right? It's not a smooth bore, it has rifling. So that thing is going to twist. These things are going to be accurate out to 500-600 yards. Not saying the soldiers could shoot that far, but the bullet would. We also see these new ships called ironclads. They have iron hulls, so they're really hard to sink. There are landmines and grenades. I'm going to post the presentation. I want you to go watch this video on the Minié ball. You know what? I'll put this video up underneath this video. Pause this video, go watch the other video in classroom, and then come back. I'll give you 5 seconds. Okay, here's a picture of a bone dug up from a battlefield of a guy shot with a Minié ball. Here is why they just amputated arms and legs. That is the hole a Minié ball makes. There is no fixing that. Today, if that happened, there's no fixing that. They would have to put in an artificial joint. Well, they didn't do that at the time. There were no artificial bones. They just hacked off your limb. We'll talk more about the medical reality of this later. All right. While Stonewall Jackson and Robert E. Lee are dominating in the East, Lincoln is really struggling to get good commanders. So let's look at some of the commanders he goes through. George B. McClellan is the first one. Really good at planning, really, really scared to go onto the battlefield. Lincoln one time says to him, you know, George, I'd like to borrow the army if you're not using it. Kind of a backhanded insult. He's replaced by Ambrose Burnside. Sweet mustache, terrible commander. The Civil War is the war of facial hair. I'm trying to achieve a Civil War look. Maybe when I come back to school in the fall, I'll have this when I see you guys next. That would be pretty sweet. Winfield Scott, Old Fuss and Feathers. He's been a commander since the War of 1812. He's almost 70 years old now. You can see he's huge. He was so big that they had to literally winch him up, use a machine to pull him up onto his horse. I feel bad for his horse. Henry Halleck is another commander. Halleck got surprised all the time. Look at him. He's surprised in this picture, let alone being surprised on the battlefield. Don Carlos Buell. Don Carlos Buell, good planner, not a great battlefield tactician. Joseph Hooker, also known as Fighting Joe Hooker. He was way more interested in chasing women around than he was in commanding a army. He one time says about Robert E. Lee, "I pray that God has mercy on Bobby Lee because I will not." And then Robert E. Lee defeated him in one of the worst defeats of ever in the Civil War. Absolutely crushed him. He was commander for one battle before he lost his job. But the two big ones for the North are William Tecumseh Sherman, kind of a crazy man who will just destroy the South later on in the war, and the most important commander of all, Ulysses S. Grant, who doesn't really gain command of the whole army until 1864, the last year, but he's been winning battles out west, and we'll look at him more. Now let's look at the Confederate generals. James Longstreet, great commander. Albert Sidney Johnson, he's really the only one in this group who was not very good. He was actually killed at the Battle of Shiloh that I just referenced, and his death really is the reason they lost. P.G.T. Beauregard, his name is something like Pierre Gustave Toussaint Beauregard. Don't quote me on that. He was from Louisiana. He was what's called a Creole. His father was a Frenchman. Jeb Stuart, cavalry commander, great commander. These guys had some serious facial hair. A.P. Hill, great commander. Here he is, Stonewall Jackson, also known as Old Blue Eyes, one of the most devastating battlefield commanders of all time. We'll look at him again in a little bit. And most importantly of all, Robert E. Lee. Get the SpongeBob reference? All right, Robert E. Lee. Probably the greatest general ever the United States has ever produced, even though he was fighting against the United States. Interestingly enough, he also didn't want the Confederacy to break away. So he was opposed to secession, but then he couldn't fight against Virginia. So we will look more at these commanders and some more battles next time. Today, all you had to do was watch the video. Make sure you watch that video on the mini ball. Talk to you later.